I never thought I'd say it, but lately, I dread the nights my husband reaches for me in bed. The weight of his hand on my thigh used to ignite butterflies. Now it just reminds me of how far we've drifted. Mark isn't cruel or thoughtless. He's just absent in all the ways that count. Physically present, yes, but emotionally locked away behind the long hours of work, the quiet dinners, and the television we barely watched together. It wasn't always like this when we married. Years ago, I was sure he was the one. I'd been a single mother for years, and when Mark came along, solid, responsible, stable, I thought I'd finally found peace. He provided structure, security, but somewhere along the way, he stopped. Seeing me, I became part of the furniture, something to maintain, not desire. Then came Ryan, Mark's son, from his first marriage. He moved in with us a year ago after finishing college, unsure about his next steps. He was supposed to stay for a few months. That turned into a year, and with each passing week, I started to notice things I wasn't supposed to. At first it was innocent, the way he offered to help me in the kitchen when Mark was buried in his laptop, the way he listened genuinely when I talked about my day. He had a quiet confidence that wasn't arrogant, just grounded, and he noticed me not just in passing, but deeply. His eyes held contact longer than necessary. His compliments, though subtle, lingered in my mind. I felt alive around him in a way I hadn't in years. The guilt came swiftly. Every smile he gave me sent a rush of warmth straight to my chest, and a wave of shame right after he was my stepson. He called me Claire, never Mom, but the title still hung over us like a boundary we were not meant to cross. Mark didn't seem to notice the shift. If he did, he didn't care enough to say anything. He was consumed by his job, working late, taking business calls during dinner, and falling asleep before I even turned off the light. We hadn't been intimate in over a month, and when we were, it felt like a chore, mechanical routine. He touched my body, but never seemed to reach my soul. One evening after a quiet dinner, Mark excused himself to work in the study. Ryan lingered behind, helping me stack the dishes. I dropped a glass, clumsy, flustered, and he reached out to catch at his hand, brushing against mine. That touch, so brief yet electric, lingered far longer than it should have. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I nodded too quickly, avoiding his eyes, but something changed in that moment. I couldn't unfeel the spark, the charged energy that passed between us. It scared me and thrilled me. That night, I lay in bed next to Mark, staring at the ceiling. He was already snoring softly, a world away from me. Even though our bodies shared the same mattress, my mind wandered to Ryan, his voice, his smile, the way he made me feel seen. I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, trying to smother the ache inside. I wasn't proud of these feelings. I didn't go looking for them, but they found me anyway, in the quiet spaces between neglect and longing. The next morning, I avoided Ryan's eyes. I buried myself in chores, in errands, in anything that would keep my thoughts from wandering. But he wasn't oblivious. He lingered a little longer in the doorway. When saying goodbye, his gaze held questions I didn't have the courage to answer. I knew then that a line had been drawn in the sand, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the tide was rising, inching closer every day. I told myself it was just loneliness, that I craved attention, not him. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just the way Ryan looked at me. It was how he made me feel. Like I still mattered, like I was still a woman, worth wanting. Something had awakened inside me, something dangerous. And I wasn't sure I wanted to put it back to sleep. For days, I tried to push the thoughts away. I busied myself with laundry, with grocery lists, with scrolling through social media, as if distraction could scrub my conscience clean, but no matter how many times. I reminded myself that Ryan was off limits. My body refused to forget the way it reacted to him, the way my heart fluttered at his footsteps, the heat that rose. When his arm brushed mine, Mark, as usual, remained oblivious. Or maybe he just didn't care enough to ask why, seemed tense, distracted, quieter than usual. If he noticed, he chose silence over confrontation. We shared the same routines: coffee in the morning, quiet, dinners separate evenings, but not the same life. We had become a rhythm without melody. Then came the storm that evening. Thunder rolled across the sky as a heavy rain began to fall. Mark had called from the office saying a last-minute project would keep him late. I didn't ask when he'd be home. I already knew not to wait. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and a movie, letting the sound of rain drown out the silence of the house. Ryan appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate, one eyebrow arched in question. "You watching this alone?" I smiled without meaning to. "Looks like it." He settled beside me, close, but not too close, handing me a mug. The warmth seeped into my hands, but the real heat came from how aware I was of his presence. The room dimmed as the storm cut the power. The screen blinked black. We sat in silence, the only light coming from the candle I had lit on the coffee table. "It's cozy like this," he said, his voice quieter in the dark. I nodded, suddenly conscious of how intimate the space had become. The storm outside seemed to blur the rules inside. I could feel his gaze on me. I didn't look back, afraid of what he might see in my eyes, afraid of what I might see in his. Then he reached out gently, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Claire," he murmured, just my name, but the way he said it made something inside me tremble. I turned toward him, heart pounding. There was no mistaking the way he looked at me now, no pretending this was motherly affection or innocent closeness. The air was heavy, electric. I should have stood up. I should have reminded him and myself of the lines we weren't allowed to cross. But I didn't move. He leaned in slowly, as if giving me time to stop him. I didn't. Our lips met soft, tentative at first, then deeper, filled with the hunger I denied for so long. I dropped the mug. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. I didn't care. I wasn't thinking. I was feeling every nerve alive, every breath drawn into him that night. I broke a vow. I never thought I would. We didn't speak when it was over. He kissed my forehead, a strangely tender gesture, and slipped back to his room. I sat there, alone in the dim candlelight, blanket drawn around me, my thoughts racing faster than the thunder outside. I should have felt filthy. I should have cried, panicked, confessed, but all I felt was live dangerously, shamefully alive. I crept into bed beside Mark. Hours later, he didn't stir. His breathing was even, his back turned toward me. I watched him, for a while, wondering how it had come to this. We had built a life of order and routine, but in the cracks of that foundation, something wild had taken root, something I could no longer ignore. The next morning, the sun returned. The storm had passed. Mark left for work without noticing anything different. Ryan avoided my gaze over breakfast, and I said nothing. The silence between us said too much already. But deep in my chest, a truth had settled. This wasn't over. A door had opened, and I had walked through it. Whatever came next, there was no going back. The days that followed were a delicate dance of avoidance. Ryan kept his distance, and I pretended not to notice. But every time we crossed paths, sat the sink in the hallway near the stairs, there was a pulse beneath the surface, a silent acknowledgement of what we'd done one moment, one night. And everything had changed. Mark remained unchanged, blind to the shifts around him. He still kissed my cheek in the morning, out of habit still asked if I needed anything from the store on his way home, still touched me at night like someone ticking off a list. I began to wonder if he had ever really seen me, or if I had just imagined we were something more than functional partners in a house we're both occupied. I tried for a time to bring myself back to him. I wore the perfume he once said he liked. I made his favorite dinner. I even initiated intimacy, hoping maybe a spark could still be salvaged. But it was like kissing paper flat dry. The motions were all there, but the emotion had long since drained from them. I stared at the ceiling afterward, empty and unsatisfied, wondering how long I could keep up this charade with Ryan. It had been different. There had been a fire, a sense of being wanted, seen, consumed, not just for my body, but for my presence. It wasn't just the thrill of taboo or the danger of crossing lines. It was how deeply I had yearned to feel something again, anything. I found myself comparing them, even when I didn't want to. Mark's touch was cold, distant. Rehearsed Ryan's had been desperate, needy, almost reverent, and the guilt that should have buried me by now hadn't, not entirely. One evening I stood outside Ryan's bedroom door, heart pounding. I didn't knock. I just stood there wondering what I was becoming. A wife, a stepmother, a woman torn in two, and opened the door without warning. Appeased when he saw me, his face a mix of surprise and something else, something unreadable. His shirt was off, hair damp from a recent shower, chest rising and falling with careful restraint. We said nothing. I turned and walked away. That was the last time we were ever alone in a room together. The tension grew unbearable. I started avoiding the house. During the day-long walks, extended grocery trips, anything to escape the walls that now knew too much. Mark noticed my distance, but mistook it for stress. He suggested a weekend away, just the two of us, a chance to reconnect. It forced a smile, and agreed, not because I wanted to fix things, but because I needed to convince myself that I hadn't fully given up. The weekend was a disaster. Forced conversations, awkward silences, one night in a hotel bed that felt colder than our bedroom at home. I lay awake listening to him snore, aching for a version of myself that no longer existed. When we returned, something in me had settled. Not peace, just resignation. I couldn't leave, not yet. Not without unraveling the whole family, but it couldn't stay the same either. I had to carry the weight of what I'd done, and worse, what I still wanted. A few weeks later, Ryan told us he'd found a job in another city. He would be moving out by the end of the month. I nodded, congratulated him. Mark clapped him on the back, proud. I kept my smile steady, even as my chest caved in quietly. Under the table the morning he left, I watched him load his car from the upstairs window. He never looked back. Maybe it was easier that way. I went back to bed. Mark was already downstairs, talking on the phone, making breakfast, living his life. I pulled the covers over my head and breathed in the silence. I've never spoken of it since. Not to Ryan, not to Mark, not even to myself. Not in full. But the memory of that night lingers in the quiet hours. The stolen glances, the hunger, the whispered name. It wasn't love. I know that now, but it was real, raw, human, and for a woman who had felt invisible for so long, it was enough to remind me that I still existed. I still lay beside my husband every night, but sometimes in the dark, I close my eyes and remember what it felt like to be wanted without.